Shabbat Shalom. It is October 8th, 2021, and this is our Machar Kabbalat Shabbat for this weekend. Probably a fair number of Machar members are kind of wondering why we're doing these Kabbalat Shabbats on YouTube instead of on Zoom, and the answer is it's wedding season for some reason now in the DC area, and so I have a lot of Fridays where I'm not home because I'm out helping people get married on Friday evenings. As you might imagine, there are a lot of rabbis who don't do weddings on Shabbat and don't do interfaith weddings on Shabbat for sure, but I'm one of them, so I'm a little tied up during this very strange time of the year for us to be having wedding season. October is not the normal wedding season. It's usually July, something like that, but venues opened when they did because of coronavirus, and people are trying to get married now. And I'm a little occupied from time to time on Fridays doing that. So to make sure that we have Kabbalat Shabbat, here we are. So we'll start with a pretty traditional Kabbalat Shabbat song, Shabbat Shalom Bim Bam, right? So Shabbat Shalom Bim Bam Chiri and Biri, 6 words. So we'll start there. Bim bam, bim 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 bam, bim 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 bam, chiri biri biri bim bam, bim 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 bam, bim 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 bam, bim bam, bim 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 bam. Bim, 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 bam, chiri, biri, biri, bim, bam, bim, 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 bam, bim, 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 bam. Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat Shalom, Shabbat, 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 Shabbat Shalom, Bim Bam, Bim 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 Bam, Bim 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 Bam, Chiri Biri Biri Bim Bam, Bim 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 Bam, Bim 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 Bam. So just as a way to greet each other for Shabbat, we sing Bing Bam Shabbat Shalom. And this is the first Shabbat after restarting the reading of the Torah portion. It's the first Shabbat of the month of Cheshvan in the Hebrew calendar. So Cheshvan is either called Cheshvan or Mar Cheshvan. And maybe it's worth talking a little bit about why we get the name Cheshvan for this month anyway. Not that you were terribly worried about it because, right, it's October and that's the month that we really calculate by for most of our daily lives, but the first month of the Jewish calendar, where we had Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot and Simchat Torah and Shmini Atzeret, and for those who observe it, the Fast of Gedalia, and there's a number of things that happen during that month. That's the month of Tishrei. This is the month of Cheshvan. It's the second month in the Hebrew calendar, and Cheshvan, like many of the other months in the Hebrew calendar, is not named for a Hebrew month. Cheshvan is not a Hebrew word. Cheshvan is adapted from a Babylonian name for the comparable month. So Israelites went into exile into Babylonia in the 6th century, the early 6th century BCE, so 597 to 587, more or less, BCE. And when they came back to the land of Israel, they had adopted the names of the months that were used in Babylonia. So we have Cheshvan. But we also have Mar Cheshvan. It's the same thing. Mar in Hebrew means bitter, and so the rabbis used to kind of explained that Mar Cheshvan was called Mar Cheshvan and not just Cheshvan sometimes because there are no holidays in Cheshvan. So this is the first month in the school year, the first month in the Jewish calendar after Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, where there's nothing happening. There are no holidays in Cheshvan, right? There's Shabbat, which I know every Shabbat is a holiday, but there's no big holiday right now that we're looking at really until next Hebrew calendar month, when we'll be in Kislev, and Kislev is when Hanukkah happens. So really Hanukkah is still almost 2 months away. But here we are in Cheshvan, a month in the Jewish calendar where there are no real, unusual, out of the norm holidays outside of Shabbat. And this is when a lot of rabbis actually kind of go, because they've made it through the high holidays and all that other stuff. But it's useful to know what's going on in your Jewish calendar so that when you open it up and you look at it and you go, what is that? You know a little bit more. So we greet Shabbat with a number of different songs, and something that we do on Shabbat is light candles and recite a blessing over wine and challah, and I don't have those ready at hand, but I'll recite the blessings. If you have candles, wine, or challah, feel free to get them out, bring them over, and I'll recite blessings, and you can light them, or, well, don't light your challah. That's not a great idea, right? Smoke detector, all of that stuff. But you can light your candles and have some wine and have some challah, and I'll recite the blessings, and you don't have to worry about that part. So we'll start with the blessing for candle lighting. Nivarech et haor ba'olam, nivarech et haor ba'adam, nivarech et haor shel Shabbat. Let us bless the light in the world. Let us bless the light in humanity. Let us bless the light of Shabbat. And if you have wine, nivarech et yotzrei pri hagafen, let us bless those who create the fruit of the vine. And if you have challah or bread or something like that, nivarech et hamotziim lechem min haaretz, let us bless those who bring forth bread from the earth. And so we have lots of songs that we can use to kind of mark Shabbat and celebrate it. And we sang Bim Bam Shabbat Shalom. I'm going to want to do one today that we don't do all of that. We don't do all that often. It's actually a Yiddish song. It's called Zol Zayin Shabbos. So it really has 4 words. Zol, which means Zol Zayin, is really a phrase. Zol Zayin means let there be. And then Shabbos is Shabbat. And then Sholem will also have the word Sholem, and Sholem means peace. So the words are, there's a lot of yai bye byes and things in there, but then the words themselves, Zol Zayin Shabbos means let it be Shabbat, and Zol Zayin Sholem means let there be peace. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bim bam. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bam. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bim bam. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bam. Shabbos, Shabbos. Zol Zayin, Shabbos, Shabbos, Shabbos. Zol Zayin, Shabbos. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bim bam. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bam. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bim bam. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bam. Sholem, Sholem. Zol Zayin, Sholem, Sholem, Sholem. Zol Zayin, Sholem. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bim bam. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bam. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bim bam. Ya ba bye, bim bam, bam. So there's lots of different songs and lots of different ways we can mark Shabbat. And one of the things that people do a lot of the time on Shabbat is look at whatever the weekly Torah portion was that's being read in a lot of the Jewish world and talk about it. And last week we talked about restarting the Torah, because last week was when the Torah reading cycle really restarted. And it restarted with Parashat Breshit, which is really the first few chapters of the book of Genesis, really the first 4 chapters or so. And we talked about the purpose of myth and why we keep looking at these stories when we don't really think that the world was created the way the Torah says it was. So this week we're at Parashat Noah. So Noah is the Hebrew word for Noah. And if you really had a hard time believing the creation story in Genesis and Parashat Breshit, you probably have a hard time believing the flood story in Parashat Noah, because that's what Noah, it's the story of Noah. So yeah, most of it is the story of the flood and the ark, and the Tower of Babel is in there, and there's a genealogy in there and all this other stuff. So what do we know about the flood? What do we know about the story of Noah from not just the Torah? So the Torah story is God is angry at the world, people are bad, and so God decides erase the world and start over and flood it, and finds Noah, who is, according to the Torah, a righteous person in his generation, and much ink will be spilled about what does it mean to be a righteous person in your generation. Does that mean that Noah was good for the people who were around, which are really bad, or does that just mean that Noah was righteous? In any event, we get the story of animals 2 by 2, or clean animals 7 by 7, and unclean animals 2 by 2, and we don't really get a lot of insight into what clean versus unclean means. And then we get the story of 40 days and 40 nights of rain, and Noah sending out birds to figure out if the floodwaters have cleared, and eventually the ark settles down and is supposed to be on Mount Ararat, which maybe is in Turkey, modern day Turkey. We don't really know. Nobody's found this thing. And we get a few other stories. We get Noah getting a little drunk after the ark is unloaded, and being unclothed, and one of his sons kind of going, oh, look, he's lying there naked, and the other 2 sons going, what's wrong with you, and backing up to put a cover on him. And we also get the story of the Tower of Babel. So humanity is weeded down to this small number of people, and then they populate again, and in the process they decide to build the tower up to heaven, and concerned about how high the tower is getting, the story goes that God kind of creates a bunch of different languages, and they're not able to talk to each other anymore, and this cooperative enterprise ends. Why are we talking about this? So there's a couple of reasons. One, the story of Noah, the flood story, has parallels in other ancient Near Eastern literature. Right? The Epic of Gilgamesh talks about a flood narrative. We've got these cuneiform tablets in Sumerian and in Akkadian, and these languages nobody speaks anymore, talking about similar things. People doing things that are bad and upset the gods, and the gods wipe the world out with a flood, but there's a survivor, and the survivor is kind of telling the story. And so we know that there are parallel kinds of literature, right? These stories are just part of what's in the water, so to speak, in the ancient Near East. So that's one thing. You can compare Judaism to the other religions around. You can compare Jewish culture to the other cultures around, and you can see where we're building off of what other people have done. It's important to remember, because it's important to remember that Judaism does change over time. That's one part of it. Another thing that it's worth thinking about in this story is that bit I mentioned about Noah getting drunk and how his sons reacted. So Noah has 3 sons according to the Torah: Shem, Japheth, and Ham, or Ham. And Ham is the one who sees Noah unclothed and drunk and doesn't do anything about it. Right? The Torah says stares at his father's nakedness or something like that. And the other two brothers kind of go, "What are you doing?" and put a cloak over their shoulders and back up and put the cloak onto Noah while he's asleep. And as a result of this episode, Ham, you can say Ham, I guess, Ham, is kind of cast out and is looked down upon, and is looked down upon for his behavior toward Noah. So I'm bringing this up because it's really important to understand the effect that the Bible has on culture, the effect the Bible has on the way we frame the world around us, and on how important it is that we stop and think about sometimes how we frame that world. And the way to kind of get your hands around this is to talk about language families for a second. This sounds very strange, but hang in there with me. So you may know that Hebrew is a Semitic language. So is Arabic, so is Aramaic, so is Akkadian, so are the various versions of Ethiopian languages that have existed over time, Amharic, and it's sometimes called Ethiopic, although that's a very out-of-date name for Ge'ez as a language. Punic, which was spoken in Carthage, but Punic is really close to Canaanite. Hebrew is originally a Canaanite language. So there are all these languages in the ancient Near East and in the modern day Middle East that are Semitic languages. Semitic languages get their name from Shem, the biblical character Shem. Up until about 30 or 40 years ago, if you studied Semitic languages at the university, you might encounter the term Hamito-Semitic languages. What are the Hamito-Semitic languages? Well, some of them are Semitic languages, and some of them are Hamite languages. Non-Semitic languages of northern, western, and part of eastern Africa. In other words, languages spoken by people who appear black. They are, according to the way scholars broke down the languages of the world, considered Hamites, i.e., the descendants of Ham, Noah's son Ham, the bad son. So at some point, Ham was associated with people who were looked upon as being black, who were frequently subject to enslavement and lots of prejudice and racism in Western culture. And so Hamito-Semitic languages is drawing from these two names, Shem, the Semitic languages, and Ham, the descendants of Ham. And so this is an example of how biblical categories get applied in ways that are not justified by reality and take on really considerable cultural significance for how people view the world, even highly educated people, how they view the world. So this Torah portion, this Parashat Noah, has some deep ties to American racism and to Western European racism and to colonial thought. So again, we look at these texts because we have to understand ourselves. And this is part of how we understand ourselves and our interactions with other people and our interactions with the world and what it means to be in American and Western society. This is part of the heavy backpack of stuff that we carry with us, and not all of it is good. So it's useful and important to know things like this, that an entire continent of people is given its name based on a negative perception of behavior by a character from the Bible who have no evidence ever really existed. That's kind of a downer when talking about how we interact with the Torah, and you want to have lots of up moments, but they're not all great moments, and this is one of those not great moments, so it's worth talking about. And it just comes to underscore we have an obligation as people who carry this document with us, the Torah and all of these other Jewish texts that have been used to categorize the world in sometimes very negative ways. This just goes to emphasize our obligation to work for change, to fix the consequences of not necessarily ours personally, but ours in a broader cultural sense, to work to undo the consequences of the negative aspects of our culture and our culture's way of existing in the world. So with that, we'll wrap up with one last song. And so what we'll wrap up with is Odyavo Shalom. So we want to recognize the idea that we're supposed to work for peace and maybe work to not break our guitar. We want to recognize that we have an obligation to work for peace. And so we'll do that by closing with Odyavo Shalom, which means there will yet be peace. Odyavo Shalom Aleinu, Odyavo Shalom Aleinu, Odyavo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. Odyavo Shalom Aleinu, Odyavo Shalom Aleinu, Odyavo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. Salam. Odyavo Shalom Aleinu, Odyavo Shalom Aleinu, Odyavo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. Salam Aleinu ve'al kol ha'olam. Salam, salam, salam. Shalom Aleinu, Odyavo Shalom Aleinu, Odyavo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kulam. So I hope you have a Shabbat Shalom, a peaceful Shabbat, and I hope I'll see you online here again soon.